making gestures at the back to me as if my voice is too loud. Is that better? Okay. So guys, welcome to this delayed kickoff because of the little fire alarm thingy-jiggy. So we're going to kick off with an hour and a half in terms of time for discussion. This session is called Ain't Misbehaving, Do British Army, do British Children Need the Army to sort them out? Question mark. We've got our four speakers, and each speaker will speak for 5 minutes, not maximum of 7. I'll be brutal with the time, just stopping mid-sentence if you over that. Let me tell you very quickly about our speakers, and I'll go in the order in which they're going to speak. First of all, we don't have one of our speakers who had to drop out. That's Catherine Burblesing due to unforeseen circumstances. But we've got a brilliant replacement, which is Michael Shaw, and this is Michael on the left from the TES. And Michael's claim to fame is, you know the term happy slapping? He invented it. And he's very famous for that. So if you pick nothing else up for this session, you go to work tomorrow and tell your colleagues you've seen the person who, for better or worse, is linked or blamed for the term happy slapping. And then second, we're going to have Jamie Bartlett. Jamie, you're very welcome. And Jamie's the head of the Balance Extremism Program at Demos and author of Under the Influence, What We Know About Binge-drinking, Truth, Lies on the Internet, and Inside the English Defence League. So he's written on a lot of stuff. And third, we have Daisy. I'm sweating, Daisy, if I got this right now. Is it Christodoulou? Oh, yeah. Brilliant. And Daisy is an English teacher. And Daisy, you've just literally finished a book, which isn't even out yet. It's been published in January. Do you want to shout out what the name of the book is?
Skills and knowledge.
And I think it's defence of subject knowledge. So that's a happy story, I think. And then lastly, by no means least, we've got Dr. Mark Taylor on the right. Mark produced this session. This session's his idea. It says in the little blurb, Mark is head of humanities and a history teacher at Addey and Stanhope Comprehensive School. But I actually think Mark is assistant principal now, and we need to update that little bit of a blurb so he's known places. And so guys, without further ado, we're going to kick off for 5 or 7 minutes with Michael, and we can thank them all at the end, guys.
Good afternoon. Yes, as I've just mentioned, I'm one of the editors of the Times Educational Supplement. And one of the parts I edit every week is our behaviour spread. So all the letters from teachers about kids who shoved them, sworn at them, come to me, descriptions of low-level disruption in the classroom. And because of that, I don't think I have a rose-tinted view of the classroom necessarily. But I think the idea there's some kind of crisis in youth behaviour right now, and the best way of fixing it is bringing in the army, isn't just absurd, it's also been a cliche for more than 100 years. One of the things I enjoy doing at TES is going back into our archives, and you find all these wonderful old headlines, front page headline with bad boys written in large letters. And this was a story about how people's behaviour is getting worse, youth crime is on the increase, and there is, quote, no longer the strong respect for the law which was common a decade ago. Young people bunk off, the persistent truant returns to school, he falls behind in his class place, and a slacker is in the process of creation. This was published in 1918, in April, while the First World War was going on, and you thought that TES had other things to worry about. It pointed out then that the blame for young people's behaviour shouldn't be put on teachers. The school has a function in disciplining the child. The child only spends 1/5 of the available time each week in school, and even less amount of annual holidays are included in the calculation. Even back then, the idea of bringing the army in or bringing cadet forces was actually quite popular. I think about 2 years before that, we had a piece. This is 1916. It was about juvenile crime going up. This is common to all large cities. And the editorial said, it is notoriously difficult to secure government action in matters of morals. The increase in juvenile crime makes immediate action necessary. Lady Selborne suggested that we should be cadet companies in elementary schools for children between the ages of 12 and 16, but it would be unsound on many besides educational grounds. Those who opposed cadet companies and some of these ideas then included G.K. Chesterton, who wrote in 1910 that there were certain debates in education that he was bored of hearing over and over again. He'd heard deafening and indeterminate discussion going on almost about me ever since I was born on whether religion was part of education and about whether militarism was inconsistent with true education. You could go on with dozens more of these examples. What I find most surprising looking back is actually how lenient the press and the judiciary can be. If you go back to 1933, there was a craze of smashing in shop windows. Discussing with Daisy earlier, it might not have been anything like on the scale of the recent London riots, but it was certainly very widespread in London. And at the time, the response from Lord Baden-Powell to all these smash and grabs wasn't to lock all the young people up. He said it was a promising sign that there was still a spirit of adventure and we need it today. And he wasn't alone in this view. I looked in the TS, and 2 years later, we quoted the president of the East London Children's Court, Basil Henriques, who used exactly the same phrase to describe juvenile delinquency during the Second World War. And Mr. Henriques added that this Spitfire spirit should be encouraged. And the Cases of Violence, I highly recommend. There's a fantastic book by a former head teacher called Adrian Elliott called State Schools since the 1950s. And he looks at a series of cases of quite extreme violence in 47, 48, within a few months of each other, involving pupils. And in Hull, 5 boys aged around 11 subjected a 9-year-old to a mock trial, and then they set him on fire. He only just survived, he had to have a leg amputated. In court, the magistrate ruled the boys had suffered enough, they realised what they'd done, so they had to pay a £5 fine and bring in chocolates and flowers to hospital. This was reported in the Times in a very short article underneath the story about the winner in the Terrier class in Crufts. That was the lack of hysteria. And we saw that time and time again in other cases. There was a 10-year-old boy, about 3 months after that, who threw a toddler into a river and calmly watched him drown. And the young murderer's solicitor offered to pay for the boy's private education. Could you imagine the Daily Mail reaction to that today in the Jamie Bulger case? Again, this appeared in the Times, a small story underneath one about hospital opening. And finally, the number of school shootings in the UK, the history of school shootings in the UK, I'm sure you know there are records going back to the 1890s of school shootings. But one in 1948 involved 3 15-year-olds in Staffordshire who set out to gun down their head teacher. But they were interrupted by a teacher, so they shot him instead. And now this was a main story in the Times, but that was just that day. There was no follow-up, there was no debate afterwards about whether the morals of young people are really right. Now, I'm not arguing, there are quite a few educational historians, including Jacob Middleton, who would argue very strongly that behaviour has improved radically over the last 100 years. I wouldn't go as far as that. I think it's different. We know certain measures, institutionally supported violence in the playground where teachers look on as people beat each other up. That doesn't happen anymore. But certain aspects like binge-drinking have got worse. Class A drug taking has gone down in the last 10 years. There's an element of swings and roundabouts. Certainly the spread of low-level misbehaviour in the classroom is arguably a change in the last 30 years, and the lack of respect from parents is also a problem. But truancy is possibly down. As for the idea of sending the army into schools, this was one that was floated again by the Labour Party 10 years ago. I don't know if any of you remember the headlines when Labour launched the Skills Force programme. I was a reporter in Bristol at the time when David Blunkett announced they were sending in army members to deal with the yobbos and terrorways. And I wrote a follow-up story because it was a school in Bristol where they were piloting this. And the day afterwards, the head teacher rang me up furious, saying, "How dare you categorise my students as yobbs?" And that's it wasn't me, it wasn't the article, I was quoting David Blunkett. It was David Blunkett's description of what this project is for. That didn't please her. She said, "Come into the school, spend a day and a half with the Skills Force team, meet the pupils who are doing it." And of course, I went in, it was nothing like popular imagination of sergeant majors screaming at kids who are out of control. It was actually a very nuanced exercise where they were helped orienteering, drawing maps, and so it was incredibly supportive. Like so many other cases, when you look at the Channel 4 programme where they send in celebrity cooks or celebrity chefs, if you give teenagers extra inspiration and extra attention, it can help. And in the case of school force, that happens. So sending in the army to schools can be a good thing on the way there.
Don't worry about clapping, we'll do all the clapping at the end. Thanks very much, Michael. What did you do with yourself, Judy?
Okay, thank you. I'll get straight into it. I may not look like it, but my father was a computer programmer, and every single Monday he would print out on this enormous IBM mainframe computer that he had in his study a little schedule for the week, for me and my brother and sister to follow. Got to draw the curtains, untie your shoelaces when you get in, make sure you make your bed. And every time we didn't do one of those things, he would put a big cross in our matrix and we would have 10 pence deducted from our pocket money. By the end of sort of 6 months, I think I was heavily indebted to him, had to take up a paper round just to pay back all the money that I got, that I had to pay back. Obviously, this is a completely specious argument. This is exactly what happened. But the problem with parenting is that everybody has an experience of parenting. Everybody here has either been parented or is a parent. So everybody has an anecdote about what they think works and what they think is best for children today. But the reason we are interested in research is because anecdotes don't usually tell the whole picture. And I want to try to bring a little bit more evidence to bear on this. So what is the problem? And I was thinking about this earlier today, and I did a little bit of research into some of the supposed social problems that we're facing. Think about gang membership. The mode age of gangs is either 14 or 19, depending on how you calculate it, and then males. As follows, 14 to 17, male. Drink driving, 17 to 22-year-old, male. The English Defence League, I've got a paper on them this evening, 16 to 21, male. Drug use, under 25, male, and I can go on. We have a problem with young men. There's too much testosterone that isn't being expended. Now, the reason that there's always been complaints about this is because it's always been a problem, and it probably always will be a problem. But I believe that what we need to do with our young men is give them more opportunities to expend that angry, useful energy in positive ways, to channel it in a positive fashion. So what does the army bring to this? Well, it brings structure, it brings discipline, it can bring task orientation. These are things which are absolutely fundamental to young people's character. Now, every study that has ever been done on parenting, and this isn't just about schools, this is about do our kids need the army. This isn't just about schools, but every study on parenting shows that to give your child the best chance in life, you need a combination of warmth, love, and time you spend with them, time spent reading to them in the evening, but discipline, crucially discipline, setting boundaries and enforcing those boundaries. Well, the problem is that we know that's also very difficult for a lot of parents today. When you think about the time that parents actually have, imagine you've got two working parents, full-time jobs, it can be very difficult to set and enforce those boundaries. Across Europe, looking at the average time spent by parents with their teenage children, in the UK we come somewhere near the bottom of that list. So this is why the army, and I know the army sounds a bit austere and extreme, but what we're really talking about is discipline and structured activity can fill the gap and can make a huge difference. And it's not only that. What the army also does is gives young people the opportunity to see beyond their own horizons. When I did my study of Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorism, one of the things that I found was one of the appeals, one of the reasons that young men were drawn into this type of extremism was because it offered a sense of adventure. It was the idea that you're going to see the world, be part of an infamous group, go out there and change the world, obviously in a very corrosive and destructive way, but that was part of the appeal. And to me, one of the reasons people were drawn into that was because there weren't the alternative opportunities available for them. This is why I think that people realise that things like the army can make a difference. That's why schools are starting to do it with positive results. That's why every single cadet class is oversubscribed with a huge waiting list. Every single scout class is oversubscribed with a huge waiting list. Because people instinctively know the value of having that discipline and those boundaries and those tasks to young people's well-being. So liberals maybe don't like it very much, but a little bit of discipline, I think, does us all some good.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And please introduce yourself.
Okay, so I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this topic. First of all, when we think about the metaphors that we use, even before this proposal was suggested, and as Michael pointed out, go back decades in time, people often speak about the classroom as being a battleground. I have one colleague who, when she was teaching a particularly difficult class, she talked about sort of metaphorically strapping on a battle armour to go and face them. And, we often talk about classrooms and being a battleground, we often talk about, teachers trying to keep kids in order, and I think this proposal, and the blurb that we've got here for this debate really sort of plays into that narrative, the idea that what we need in school is like a shock force of reinforcements to wind the kids into the dust. But what I want to suggest today, I want to suggest a different metaphor maybe for looking at the classroom. And then I want to suggest, the title of this speech is, the title of this topic is, do British children need the army sorted out? And what I want to think about is ways perhaps that teachers and the education system could benefit from thinking derived from the army. So first of all, if I think about these metaphors then, I think rather than viewing teachers and children as on the other side of no man's land, we need to try and view ourselves being on the same side. So if we see a teacher as, if we want to continue the army metaphor, see a teacher as an inspirational leader or a captain, and the pupils being more like the troops who they're leading into battle and to achieving their level possible. And in this metaphor, if I can extend it further, the enemy force will be the intangible force of ignorance. Okay, so we'll probably extend that metaphor enough for you. But from the way I've discussed that, you'll see as well that obviously, the army is a very hierarchical institution. You have ranks, and those ranks are very clearly defined. And some people might say, well, that's precisely the last thing we need in teaching now. Isn't there enough hierarchy? Teachers are constantly being told what to do by some bosses, senior management, government. Don't we need to give teachers a bit more freedom? And this brings on to the second thing I want to talk about, what can teachers and schools perhaps learn from the army? Which is that although the army is a hierarchical institution, from my understanding of it, isn't necessarily actually that top-down. And one of the principles of successful armies is to delegate decisions to the lowest level possible. Because you want to delegate decisions to the people on the ground who have the most information. And in an army that's particularly important because lines of communication are frequently cut, they're unreliable, so you have to vest interest in those frontline officers. In particular, the captain, who's very often the senior frontline officer. And my hunch is that captains and I think senior classroom teachers, I do want to sort of extend this analogy, this comparison between them, because I think what's interesting as well, I looked at the pay scales, the sort of senior classroom teachers and the captains of the British Army, and they're fairly similar. And I think there are some between them, but I think that captains have a great deal more freedom and a great deal more responsibility in the way they can go about doing what they do than teachers do, than classroom teachers do. And again, I think that comes back to one of the principles of the way that armies are organised. General Patton, the American general, he said, never tell a man how to do something. Tell him what to do, and he will surprise you with his ingenuity. And I think that something like this, a principle like that, could really, really benefit schools. And I say this because I think what we've got in schools at the minute is precisely the things the other way around. So teachers are told in great detail how to micromanage things, and what they're meant to be doing, and exactly how the techniques they should be using, and what they should be doing. Look at things like the National Literacy Strategy, the numeracy strategies. In 2004, the DFES, it was then published a whole pack of pedagogy, thousands of words long. But I think that actually then, in terms of what the final aim is, I think there's actually a bit of a dearth in the British education system. That actually people aren't quite sure, what the overall is. I think if you speak to 10 people in education, what's the aim of the British education system? You get 20 different answers. Is it to improve economic well-being? Is it to make kids happy and socialised? Is it to pass on cultural inheritance? No one's quite sure. If an army went into battle without thinking, with no idea what its overall aim is, but a welter of micromanaged tactical details, I think they'd be wiped out. And I think actually in the classroom we are being wiped out by the force of ignorance. So I think that actually, I think discipline is one thing, but if we look at these other things that I've outlined, why are we in the classroom, what are we trying to do, how are we going to best achieve that, how can we best give authority to our teachers, I think we could learn lots from the army. And I think so perhaps if some officers and captains and people like that came into the classroom, perhaps we could benefit from that, not just the discipline side of things. So that's my opinion. Thanks.
Daisy, thank you very, very much. Mark, over yourself.
Okay. The question about the army, the basic answer is no. They shouldn't be there. Or they should be there if I, as a teacher, can go to Afghanistan and Iraq and advise the army about some aspects of the history of the situation. So I think there's one of the problems is that we're all forgetting our roles. But the reason we're forgetting our respective roles in society is because we don't really know what education is for anymore. Now, into that gap of education, because it's maybe a thesis I've stated a lot, but into that gap goes anything. So at the moment, behaviour really in schools is a subject. And so there are all sorts of people that have tips about what we should do. how you should actually interact with the students. And they're actually needed, because a lot of teachers come into schools at the moment and they're not clear about how you would start something off in a way that's not disruptive and then can lead you to get to the higher level that you want to get to. So, for example, this gentleman here has been eating a sandwich during this session. So obviously that's fine if you're in a session like the Battle of Ideas, no one's got a problem with it. But if you translate that down into school with somebody chewing gum, this, please don't think I'm not an idealist, right? But it can lead to a major problem if that teacher has not thought through the impact of everybody chewing when they want to in the lesson. Of course, you're immediately thrown into issues of freedom and authority. But then it doesn't just stay with what you eat, it's coming in silence. Would you have a boy-girl seating plan? Seating plan, if you're not familiar with the topic, may seem like, oh my, this is incredible from the schools. But you do actually need some way of creating order in your room so that you can get things up to a high level. My personal top tip, because I know some people want top tips, is that if you're going to use glue, put it on the table before the lesson starts. Because if you're going to give out glue during the lesson, that leads to the order being disrupted, and then you've got a behaviour problem. And then you get all these little things that break down the authority in the room, lead to teachers thinking, these kids are out of control, I don't know what to do. Okay, so if you've got a teacher that's accepting that, but she could easily be sitting there thinking, I don't want to talk about glue in a session on education. But the reality is that people don't have a clear view of how to set up order in a room in front of them, because there's no wider understanding in society about how you create order. So I'm not personally in favour of the army being used to do this, but you've got to recognise that when children leave out of school every night and get on the bus, a lot of people don't get on that bus because there's kids on the bus. So that's a problem that extends beyond teachers. Everybody thinks that once kids are around, you back off. Translate that through society and you have got the beginnings of a significant problem. Now, the next problem is that when this all gets filmed, in any education programme you can choose that you like, Educating at 6, Jamie's free schools thing, or whatever it was called, everybody, the filmmakers in particular, but the people all watching it, always pick up on the behaviour. I've not seen any educational film in the last 5-10 years that's focused on school life, that focuses on the absolute joy or transformational impact of developing someone's intellect. You just don't see it. It doesn't seem to be anything that fascinates anybody. But again, that's a kind of crisis of expectations in our whole society about what you look at when you see a child in a room. But it's the same in, you put that back in the classroom. I have got some ex-students in the room. If they came to my lesson now, they would be happy to, I'm happy to say, that they would come in and you could come in silence. But when you three were there, they're all over there, they all got A's, by the way, in history, but they had to fight to actually get themselves heard sometimes in my lessons. That wasn't because I didn't believe that they should be all listening in silence. It's just that we didn't have the expectation through the whole school about what it means to create the conditions to learn in a good way. And the reason we don't have that is that either people think it's irrelevant or they just don't have confidence that you can expect people to sit and listen in silence as people do at the Battle of Ideas. If this is how you can take ideas in this context, then you need the same in schools. But people have forgotten that and they've got into things like let kids have a bit of freedom, they're just inner city kids, you can't expect that much from them, they can't concentrate for an hour. All cliches that you'll be familiar with. And not all the cliches are wrong, some kids do find it hard, but the thing is if the expectation goes down from the teachers and the schools in general, and the wider society, by which I include the audience, what you expect when you interact with a child anywhere, then this is going to affect how we perceive behaviour. So behaviour, instead of being seen as behaviour in a scholarly way, concentration, becomes reduced to disruption and things like that. And that in itself, the problem is that it's becoming really a subject in schools, or it has become a subject in schools. And the reports always say that new teachers want to know how to get behaviour management sorted out more than the subject because it's more practical. But of course, I'm not trying to say that ultimately, if you've got something to say and teach, it is going to drive things up. But I'm aware that we're not in a society anymore that you can guarantee that. And I think that's what we have to face the fact that there is a problem, but I would like to see what people in the room think about that.
Mark, thanks. Guys, give them all a Guys, your timing was brilliant, so very, very well done, very disciplined. I was ill-disciplined because I didn't tell you who I was, I don't think. So I'm Captain Rooney, and I'm from the IoI Education Forum, and I'm a teacher and head of social science in a big comprehensive in Hertfordshire. Look, I've got quite a few questions, so I wanted to take maybe less than 5 minutes to fire a couple to the panel, and then we'll go out. I have actually 6 questions lined up I wanted to ask. I'm going to ignore those 6. I'm going to concentrate on some things that people said. Can I go around the room and just ask immediately? Michael said the fact that there is no crisis.
No particular crisis now.
No particular crisis now, where danger of getting into the golden ages of here. Can I just whiz around the table and just ask, do you buy what Michael's saying, or do you want to say no, there's something specific about today which is different?
I think we're probably in a state of perpetual crisis, and society is always struggling, and has always struggled, to control and socialise young men in particular. I don't think there's anything unusual in that or particularly surprising about that, and I think we should recognise that and think about ways we can deal with that. We no longer have any wars, which means that we have to find other ways to keep our young men occupied.
I guess I do agree things are different, things do change, they're not the same. I was talking about before, Michael, and I think low-level disruption is a problem now that wasn't a problem perhaps 30, 40, 50 years ago, and not a problem in the same way. And I think low-level disruption perhaps may not be sort of, it's not going to grab headlines, it's not going to be, it's not as terrible, isn't it, that someone's stabbing someone, I'm aware of that. But low-level disruption in terms of the education that can take place is extremely damaging, pervasive low-level disruption. And I do think, and again, it is hard to measure these things, I do accept that, and I think we do have to go beyond anecdote, and it's hard to go beyond anecdote, but I think that's a big, big thing, and that's something that I don't think many people have the answers to. I don't.
I think there is a kind of crisis when you're in a society where 50-year-old men are going on skateboards on Brighton seafront. The Stone Roses are reforming and they still look the same as they did when they were first playing. There's clearly a crisis of the way people kind of grow up. So in that sort of context, there's bound to be a crisis in classrooms about what you expect from people. And you do have to be honest, I think, that there is this issue about what's called low-level disruption. But it isn't low-level disruption, it's a crisis of adult expectations of the students. And basically believing that you can't get much out of them. But that's not the teacher's fault, as much, well, it is partly the teacher's fault, but the exam boards don't really demand that much either, if we're really honest. They don't look for people to get to this really high level. But please criticise me, because there's people possibly going to say, look, there's gifted and talented, all these things exist if you want to succeed. But I'm saying, yes, I think there is something specific that is leading to lower expectations of students in a scholarly sense, and that needs poor behaviour in front of you.
Dead on. I'm going to ask you a question, Jimmy, only you. If anybody else wants to answer it, fine. This might sound a strange question, but I'm going to ask it. You make the point, anecdotes don't tell you much about parenting or teaching, and we need research and social science and stuff. See, I would always be inclined to say, parenting's not science, and to hell with your research. And even when it comes to teaching, that there are many ways to skin a cat in terms of how you teach. So what would you say to someone like me who'd be quite critical of what you're saying?
I'd say you've got absolutely no idea what you're talking about. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. My point is more that something like parenting, we all have an opinion on it. And I've had so many debates about, well, I was brought up this way and I turned out fine, or my brother did this, and that's absolutely fine, because everybody is brought up slightly differently, some people buck the trends and all the rest of it, but there are just some very, very general guidelines that seem, on aggregate, to make a real difference, and that is simply a combination of lots of warmth and attachment and lots of discipline and boundary setting. There's nothing bizarre about that, and every single study that I've ever seen on this subject comes up with the same conclusion, including the one I did, by the way, on binge-drinking that you mentioned, where if you're 16 years old and your parents combine those tough boundaries with attachment, if they don't rather, then you're 10 times more likely to end up being a binge drinker at that age than if they do. It really makes a difference.
One point of the parenting class is they're often being presented as some sort of sinister state plot to teach parents how to do their jobs. It's very interesting. The last 2 months we're starting to see lots and lots of private schools offering them because there's a demand for parents for them, and that's a very different state of affairs.
Yeah, can I just add, sorry, just because I never want to sort of provide patronising advice to parents. It's very, very generic. It isn't, you should read to your child for 5 minutes at 6 p.m. and again at 9 p.m. make sure they're tucked into bed by 10:30. Nothing like that. It's just very, very basic rules.
Okay, I have a lot to say on that, but I won't. I'll let the audience pick up on that parenting thing. Mark, I've got 2 questions. The first is the less important of mine, and it really made me split hairs, but again, it does me. When you talk about the guy eating a sandwich or somebody eating chewing gum, and you're talking about the need to create order, and you're talking about all those different things, and the glue and the this and the that. So in my class, for example, I let students eat sandwiches and that, and even chew gum, as it happens. Now, I'm lining myself up for a smarter mark from you here, of course, but the point is that I'm getting at, I teach mostly 6th formers right enough. The thing about it is, they get good results. I think I inspire most of them half the time. It's a happy story in terms of I teach them. So isn't that a danger in the way that you present your argument, that you're sort of like obsessing with what might be the sort of like formulaic or formal approach? And is that how I phrase it, about you're exercising authority but you're not actually in authority? Would you recognise that criticism, or how would you come back on that?
I recognise the criticism. As I became an assistant head last year, I was given the poison chalice of behaviour policy. So I decided to run with it and try and see if I could do it, but also make it inspirational, to get away from just focusing on behaviour. And I think you can actually do it, because a lot of children actually do have very strict behaviour understanding, and they don't like it when some other kids mucking about and interrupting their learning. I recognise that the issue isn't really the kid. You can rules or uniform or switch your mobile phone off. These are all basic things that you need in some way. I know that some people say, well, what about learning with a mobile phone? That's a way of learning. Well, it is. It's just as long as the teacher in the room's got the authority to get what they want, to get people up to the high level. And I'm not saying that I don't battle with things like a kid who's got his chewing gum up there and he's hiding it from me, but it becomes a bit of a game, and I think mostly you just try and get people away from that and onto the high level points all the time. And obviously the other extreme are people who are obsessed with it, and that, the old school Hitler types who are end up shouting at the students all the time. I used to be one of them. But you're not getting anywhere in the long run like that. I'm not saying don't shout at the students. Sometimes they don't need it. They do need it sometimes. The key thing is that you believe enough in what you're doing. But the really key thing is that not enough people anymore have a common understanding of what it means to have children socialised in order to learn to a high level. And if you're in the inner city, without sort of making any bones about it, it's pretty difficult because people are coming in with all sorts of different expectations. We often have some parents who say to the child, "You're not behaving, you're going back to Nigeria." This is how they will tell their children what's going to happen to them, and that's completely outside our control. And they think that will help them. To be honest, the confused messages is what leads to the problem in the end, because the school doesn't know how to respond. The school's not clear. The people in the school aren't clear. The wider society's not clear. That's the bigger issue.
Okay, and that brings me to the last question, and then we'll go out to the floor. We've got lots of time still. And something that Mark said as well, I wonder if any of you got a view on it. There's lots of different ways you can say this, and really the question is our debate really not about the army here, and is it not even really about teachers in school? Is this really a debate about adults and our lack of confidence in how we bring young people up? Some people refer to it as the abdication of adult authority, the crisis of adult authority. Even at the most mundane level, that when you're on a bus and kids are using bad language, you won't pull them up, our kids are breaking some glass or bottle on the street corner and you walk by, you don't have the confidence to check them. That type of sort of like point, does any of the panel have anything to say on that broader point before I bring it out to the audience for contributions?
I do think the fear of youth crime over what happens, whenever there are polls of parents about the behaviour in their schools, they've done this in London, they've done this in various places in the UK, and when you talk about your own child's school, the results always come back saying, actually it's pretty good, to be honest. And then we say, well, what's behaviour in the education system like generally? They come back going, it's dreadful. And the same thing also with young people, we see this wide perception of how young people are, and then we say, well, how about your neighbour's daughter, or they're lovely. So it's probably, I'm realising I'm blaming the media, which is me on this panel, but yeah, it's probably me as well.
Anybody else, guys, want to say anything on that?
I think I'm now using anecdotes because I've heard it often said, you know, children are treated like adults and adults are treated like children. I think there's probably something in that. And I agree, this is about how we as a society, the adults of our society, socialise young people. So yeah.
Do you have to say anything you want to? We'll pass Daisy, Mark, and then we're out.
Yeah, I just think the issue is always, it's very easy and people love doing it, sort of blaming somebody else for their own problems. So whether it's you say that the kids misbehave, so drinking a can of Coke or something like that, or their background, these are the ways that people explain things, and the only thing that's going to bring it back is if adults do take responsibility for their own education, and then the wider society itself believes in education. You would probably have a different set of programmes on TV, a different set of reports about what aspirations mean, and that in itself would play some part in recreating a bit more of a space for people to go into, children and teachers in our society, about what our aspirations are as a society.
Guys, I'm going to make a unilateral decision, and panel, pull me up if I'm wrong. It's 25 to 5, we could go to 5:30. Because of delays, I was going to stop this session at 5:15. That gives us 40 minutes. I think that's hot and sticky. Do you agree with me or no?
Yeah, I've got to be out by 5:15. I'll be out by 5:15. I've got to leave at 5:15.
Okay, so that means we'll still got 40 minutes and we'll stop at 5:15. We'll take 3 or 4 people as we promised would come in. You're getting a hard time, this army stuff, it's a lot of nonsense some of the people are saying. Do you want to come back and try to back up your points?
No, it's not. Well, because it's not just about school, it's about the provision of structured activity, and there is not enough of it. I mean, look at the market. Every time we have a school that talks about bringing in these types of things, the parents are supportive of it. Every time, as I said, we have scouts and other structured activities, they're so oversubscribed because people recognise the value of it. So I'm not suggesting that we have sergeant majors in front of the classroom barking orders at people. The army is actually a lot more nuanced than that, of course. These are people that often go on humanitarian trips overseas. They get to travel the world. There are other aspects of the army that can be of value for young people in understanding what the world out there is actually like.
Go on, Dizzy.
Yeah, I mean, my point when I was talking about the army is to think of the army, you know, I think it's very arrogant of anyone to think we can't learn from any other aspects of life. The army is a large, competent, bureaucratic state organisation, so is education, so is health, you know, so is the police. My way of looking at it from that bureaucratic point of view, from the way, you know, how do you organise institutions, how do you get things to work, you know, when you give orders, how do you make sure that they happen, what's the best way of doing that? And in that sense, you know, you said I was undermining teachers. The entire thing I spoke about was empowering teachers. You know, absolutely. Of course I would, you know, want to see teachers micromanage even more than they are at the moment. And that was why I was saying, actually, you know, if you bring in some army thinking, maybe it won't undermine teachers. We can all learn from stuff. You know, I'm sure the help is a state organisation, but they can look at the way that education does things and think that's good, that's bad. You know, you can learn from things, you can pick things up, you can throw things away. And that's what I'm trying to do. I don't know a lot about it, I know a lot more about education. You know, I've spoken to people in the army on this speak, I read some books about it, you know, I had to talk to people about it, and I just, you know, this thing about the top-down, the non-top-down nature is really, really interesting. And that general pattern quotation, you know, never tell a man how to do something, tell him what to do, and you're surprised with ingenuity. I couldn't agree more on what you're saying. I think, yeah, parents, teachers, trust them. There's many different ways, you know, to get the end goal. We should trust people to do that.
2 years ago, we introduced the cadets force into our school. We have these Friday debates in our school which are legendary. And we had a Friday debate about should we be introducing the cadets into our school. And two of the points that came up, one was about why should we be bringing in militarism into school. It's just, it's a reaction, it's backward. But the second, which I actually think is interesting, but the second more interesting point that came out was that you're almost settling for just keeping their attention for discipline structure, and you're almost missing the bullseye, which is the focus on knowledge and the imparting of knowledge. Now obviously Jamie and Daisy, you're probably going to say you need to structure of discipline before you can then have the right sort of contact to impart the knowledge, but I thought that
I
was...
would just say that I would say that any army that only focuses on structure and discipline would lose. Overall aim of an army surely is to win the battles and win whatever you've got ready to engage in. So any army that just focuses on structure and discipline is clearly a good army.
Brilliant. Do you want to say something? We'll go back.
I was going to say, I think that Dave's points about how you can learn from other systems is fascinating. In the recent weeks, there's been a huge amount about the checklist approach to behaviour in schools, based on US medical research, where they were looking into why certain jobs people in life die than others, and suddenly realising the safest jobs being an airline pilot and some very, very weird. And by researching that, they realised it was because of these checklists before takeoff. So various hospitals in the US, they introduced the same checklist system, the mortality rate, quality. And now we're looking at, now there's a huge discussion using this in schools in the UK as well. This has been announced about 4 weeks ago. So that you can learn things from the road. The one thing I'd say, I'm next to an anecdote, but a dear friend of mine, he fought in the First Gulf War and then became a teacher about 10 years later, and had a horrible first year. And he's a fantastic teacher now, he's teaching at Minster. But I remember seeing him in the first year and asking, well, why couldn't he stamp his authority? And he was saying, well, I don't have a gun. But the idea of teaching you, I think with automatic gun would be brilliant and it doesn't get.
Okay, so we've got the army one, and we've got Mark's point about the crisis of expectation, the crisis of socialisation.
Well, actually about the autonomy and behaviour is fascinating. That's one of the many examples we've had since the new coalition government came in, where on the one hand we were constantly told schools need to be autonomous and they need to be free and they need to have total control of what they do, while they're meanwhile being given detailed instructions on behaviour planning, phonics, whether when they're going to teach Empire, what they're going to offer, and even arguably should they go in cadet forces. So there's a massive conviction at the heart of the system, and understand why people are serious about it.
If not, I'll go back out. No? Go on.
Only that autonomy, much as I love it as an idea, doesn't always work. It has led some teachers to be criticised for low expectations. That autonomy has been a mask for, frankly, poor professionalism, and it is a reality.
Well, we'll come back to that. Well, what I would say though, you're saying that it's about
Yes,
autonomy.
no,
Autonomy of when it comes back to this thing of, what I said about strategy and tactics, or the what and the how, that if you're setting, if you're setting you've got a rigorous view of what you want, then you can lead people up to do it and say, look, achieve that, and however you do it, that's fine. So you're right, you've got to have a balance. You can't just total, absolute freedom to go after what you want, but as long as you've got a firm, thing at the top saying this is what we want, and then give people the room to innovate and try and achieve that. So that would be my answer to that.
Okay, we can't answer nothing. We've got the formulated behaviour and management policies being the problem. And can I just pick up on some of the girls said there, which is really interesting about the lack of inspiration and also exam pressure and time to non-specific. I had an interesting problem. I had to deal with these three girls in my school. I had to go to school on Monday during midterm break because the three girls said that the psychology teacher was boring and they weren't really working very hard for her, and they actually said, she doesn't entertain us, was the word that they used. She doesn't engage us. And your points got me thinking, which is really interesting, about the flip side of that. Is there a problem that we almost expect the teachers now to entertain the students, and they're not used to the idea that sometimes lessons may just be boring and hard work and you have to go through the pain barrier? Not that you're wrong, but anything you want to pick up on, guys, whatever.
Certainly, that seems one of the most unfair things I think that's happened in the teaching profession in the last 10 years has been this habit of saying if your lesson was more engaging, you wouldn't have behaviour problems. And we've got his session in TS next week by Bartlett, in which she argues that if you have a teacher reporting tap dancing penguins, for certain classes it's not going to work unless it works both ways. Sometimes you need to have a base level of behaviour in place before you can get anything across. But that's not to say the other point that was made earlier about if you can have teachers who have that passion about the subject and can get across, then yes, of course, that can create a relationship with people who somebody can trust.
A couple of points. I don't disagree at all with the aspirations and inspiring teachers and all the rest of it. I feel like I've been boxed in to say that that's not important. I actually wrote a paper on how important moral autonomy for teachers was a couple of years ago. And I have some sympathy with the moral autonomy point, but to me the army in this discussion is really a proxy for structured discipline, and that is the way that moral autonomy and responsibility is transmitted, actually. So I really don't think that you're removing moral autonomy by setting boundaries for people to follow. And the final point is this thing about parents, which I also feel is slightly caricatural. The simple fact is, we know that children of well-off parents do much better, not only because their parents are well-off, but because their parents spend much more time with them, ferrying them to and from orchestra lessons and all the rest of it. And the unfortunate fact is that the people that are disadvantaged, that is much harder. So all we've ever said in terms of parenting is the importance of allowing parents more time and opportunity to do those things, hence more investment in things like Sure Start, more investment in things like structured opportunities, particularly in disadvantaged communities. Now, I really don't think that is lecturing to parents or patronising parents in any way, shape or form.
Right. And Daisy, just to say again, the argument Toby here is picking with you and with Jamie. He says that the army can't teach teachers anything de nada.
I think, obviously, I would want to defend the specificity not just of teaching, but of any kind of profession. Absolutely. I would presume to tell a heart surgeon how to operate on the heart. They would presume to tell me, I guess, how to teach the metaphors in Romeo and Juliet. Fair enough. On those specific categories, of course. But, beyond that, there are so many things that can learn people in every walk of life. And I do really think it is arrogant to box yourself off and say, education only, that's it, I'm not going to talk to anyone outside of this. I myself have had conversations with GPs, obviously not about prescribing medicines, but about the way that they, when younger patients come to see them, how they deal with them. And I've had really profitable discussions with a GP over that I think are really useful. I mean, to say that I can't learn anything from them, they can't learn anything from me, I think, we clearly can. And my broader point where I was talking about the army as well was also not just individual practitioners, but about the nature of an entire institution. And again, I would always want to maintain specificity. Of course there will be areas where, things aren't perfectly comparable. There's always going to be things, you can't just map things on some things. But, in the context of large, complex organisations that have significant state involvement, there's a number of obvious overlaps where I think, it just makes sense to look at it. Maybe you're going to reject it, but it's looking at it.
Mark?
The thing is, it is happening. So when this idea originally came up, it was in the white paper, Let's Bring Truth to Teaching. And then it faded away. And then at the end of the summer, I don't know what the think tank's called, came up with the paper called Something Can Be Done. And that's about a free school in Oldham that has got proposed to be run entirely by ex-members of the army. But the broader point is it could be anything. There'll be something else that comes along about experimenting in education, because there is no clear understanding anymore of what we're supposed to do. But I also don't think, it's almost like you can't trust any word, or autonomy I don't trust anymore, because I think that just allows some teachers to avoid the issue. But if you look at the X Factor, Simon Cowell has gone right to the USA, and the judges started arguing. I don't know if that's just a media setup, but it's obvious that authority, which was personified by him, has now gone to the States with him as he tries to set it up in the States. Now, I really don't know if they've set it up, but the judges can't even agree about how to interact publicly. Is that just for the audience or not, or is it just great TV? But there's clearly some way that authority is totally personalised at the moment throughout our society. And until we get something back about what it means as a general expectation of adults, it's going to be really difficult to go beyond it. And that's my main concern. I hate it when it starts to feel pessimistic, but I do worry that, because I've never really argued that schools have had everything dumped on them in a way that some people have, but you do feel that the schools where, or an individual teacher like this is all going to be thrown back at them to come up with the form of authority, but there won't be a general understanding of what you do once you go outside the school, and until we address that outside the schools, I think it's really going to be difficult to move on this.
I've got the old X Factor Sky Plus last night, watching it go home. You guys, in the last round of the contribution, and can the panel be thinking, what's the sort of the core final point they want to leave us with? Authority, should teaching be entertaining, structure, formulaic policies, autonomy, discipline, and I'm forgetting this young girl's point about the need for inspiring teachers as well. So whatever you want, and Jamie, we'll start with yourself, if that's all right.
Right. Well, I'm glad I've suitably annoyed everybody. I'll just bring up a few points. I'm not sure if I can respond to everything. I mean, the policy failure to me has been, what we know about what makes good schools really good is autonomy for teachers combined with lots of skills and investment in those teachers and sanctions when they don't perform. But that's what we know. That hasn't happened. And I don't think those things are juxtaposed or mutually exclusive with going outside of the school, and outside of teachers to bring other people in. I find it to be extremely hubristic to think teachers can't learn. You didn't say can't learn from the army, you said from any other profession. I think schools need to start bringing in Google executives to teach kids how Google's algorithms work, because no one seems to know they're so central to how young people access and understand information. So that's just one example. Now, when you give schools more autonomy, as we are and we should, some schools are going to want to experiment with particular things. That's another thing that we know works really well for education. And some of those schools, in some circumstances, will want to experiment with the army, with other types of high levels of discipline. Now, the results for me seem to speak for themselves, because those things have been proven to work. I'm not saying in the end that, Sergeant Major's barking front is the way that this is done, but bringing other people in to provide that discipline structure to me seems to work. In some circumstances, I agree, not all the time. And look what the parents want. The parents often want this kind of thing. Now, there's a couple of things. I think we're being a little bit down on the army, because there's another side of this, which is physical activity that they can provide. We're ripping down all of our school playgrounds. Young kids in city centres don't have the chance to run around and expend their energy. That's something too. My brother's a boxing instructor, by the way, so he teaches young kids from disadvantaged communities to train to be boxers rather. And there's something positive about that the army can also teach, which is it's not cool to play around with drums. Going into war is not something that should be taken lightly. I think there are other things that the army can bring to that we haven't actually raised so far.
Thanks, Jimmy. And Michael?
One of the comments I thought was most interesting that was saying that Daisy said about the idea that she wouldn't presume to tell a heart surgeon what to do, and a heart surgeon wouldn't presume to tell her details of teaching. Unfortunately, a lot of politicians and again journalists don't feel the same and do feel the need to micromanage what's going on in the classroom. That is part of the reason why teachers lost their autonomy. But I would stress again that I don't think even the loss of autonomy is like around the new crisis. 1918, the TDS wrote, the schoolmaster has been too much interfered with by well-meaning but mistaken people. Consequently, a recalcitrant boy or girl is allowed to go uncorrected and bad traits are developed in the formative period. On the subject of running around and the joys of the cadet force, I was an RAF cadet and actually going camping and running around with guns was great fun. I don't think it's actually a solution for all schools' problems. And to end with a not worse than an anecdote, a fictional anecdote, you think the CCF is the answer. I do recommend you go and rent out Lindsay Anderson's classic film, If, and watch the ending of that.
Thanks. I'll just come up by taking a general point about the policy proposals that I would like to see on the political to solve this. And like I say, it will come down to this point of teacher autonomy, which Michael just spoke about there. I think the government should be setting a strategy, setting right on what's the aim for education in this country. For me, I know what that aim will be, but it's, again, that's what democratic civil society have to work out. For me, the aim would be similar to what Albert said. It would be about knowledge, it would be about cultural inheritance, it would be about passing that down through generations. So that was how what I would like to see the overall aim. But whatever overall aim you come up with, whatever you want to try and do in the classroom, at some point, you have to get the kids to listen. And like I said, that's what stressed again and again, one of the biggest problems that I think I see and see my colleagues see is that problem of low level instruction. It's all too easy, as we've said, to say, if you have a great lesson that's fun, kids will listen. I've walked into the classroom with great lessons, gone down really well classes. If the kids are sitting there and chatting and they won't shut up, you can have the greatest lesson in the world, it doesn't matter. So I think that's absolutely fundamental that, discipline in that sense is important. We can't get away from that. But like I say, you know, whilst I think that will end up being one of those things that everyone would see as being important, I am keen to give teachers autonomy, to give schools autonomy, them to come up with the best way of working, the best way of succeeding, whatever works for them. I'm keen to give them autonomy, and that's what I'm aiming on, giving teachers the freedom.
I think there has been a policy failure, but there's also been a public failure. The failure of the public to demand that education means more than exam results. I'm trying to sort of push that on a bit. What I mean is we all teach in everything we do. We all set an example, a moral example, as well as a technical example to the people in front of us. That's not just the students. And that something has gone in terms of our ideals, if we had them, as a society. And maybe those ideals were old-fashioned. The film I recently watched is called The Hill. It's from the 1960s, about an army camp, and it's just about how discipline breaks down. But basically, the 60s is full of films like that. So there's something changed. I do believe, I don't know if it was the 60s or not, but there's something changed about what adults believed. It was how you set an example. And what I'm saying at the moment is there's a creative opportunity. It's not necessarily a problem. There's an opportunity for us to restart what it means to be an educated adult. But because at the moment, policies separate, public separate, autonomy, much as I defend it, I'm not sure people know what to do with that at the moment. So it's almost like we need to bring back all these concepts and maybe sit down in a room and recreate the government. Okay, maybe that's a bit too idealistic, but there's something missing from what we're trying to do at the moment, and teachers don't really know, in a way, what the society is they're preparing students for. Even if you go to university, universities don't really seem to know what it is they want, apart from that some universities are just better than others. So whether you should smack a kid in Africa or not, I don't think you really need to go that far. I think you can do it with a humane, inspirational, intellectual approach. I haven't got a problem with certain forms of punishment and such, but I think the broader problem, I said this morning, is what the public wants from education, or do they think that education has anything to do with them? Because at the moment, it's like you see a TV programme about kids misbehaving, and you really just think, oh, I'm glad my kids don't go there. But actually, there's a bigger problem there about what we all expect from ourselves.
Can I just say, it's been a hard afternoon in this room. Can I thank you for your attention, and can I thank you for lots of your contributions? But can I ask you to give a big thanks to Jimmy, to Michael, to Addey and Stanhope.